Hey guys, Third and Only here, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be converting some heavy support for my Inquisitorial strike force. We're going to be using as the basis for this conversion mainly the Ironstrider and Kataphron breaches kit. Some other kits are used, such as the Imperial Knight, but not in any great amount. The lower half of the Kataphron breacher was cut out and cleaned up as normal, and assembled more or less as normal, leaving us with this nice little tracked section to support our big gun from later on. However, there were some mechanicum details that needed to be removed. Though the little pointy bit on the top of this armor panel fits in perfectly with our scions, these cog bits have to go, along with some other mechanicum details around the kit, like this mechanicum symbol on the side, which is cut off and then shaved flat, which would leave you with this great spot to attach your own symbol if you were so inclined, though I didn't end up doing this. The twin las cannon from the Ironstrider was cut out and stuck together, but unfortunately there's no easy way to just stick this onto the mounting point. So I took this piece from the Kataphron breaches kit and did a little comparison between it and the gun. Some parts here clearly weren't necessary, and that big bit on top was the first to go. Some other pipes and pistons were also either shaved down or removed entirely to allow the gun to fit properly against it. And this armor plate from the Ironstrider was glued to the front. The curves lined up almost exactly. It was quite nice. The guns could then be glued into place as intended on this armor plate, and nicely, everything was lining up more or less as I'd envisioned. It was then able to be glued to the lower half of the assembly, and everything seems to be fitting together quite harmoniously at the moment. But not entirely harmoniously, some bits don't line up yet, so some green stuff was mixed up and then rolled out into little pipes. These pipes were attached from the little side bit, I don't know really what it is, from that attachment, and attached to the firing pins, and one also further back into the model to tie it all together. This wasn't the only putt used in the model though, some milliput was mixed up. Now, I had a big period of back and forth on the back section of this model to figure out exactly what I wanted to put there, but eventually I settled on this Imperial Knight control panel, and this milliput was used to allow it to better fit on the model. The piece that was originally meant to go there, you might have just seen glued to the underside in his exhaust. Turning to the Imperial Knight control panel also led me to the perfect pilot, the Imperial Knight pilot. And unfortunately, there wasn't a particularly good way to make the standing variant work. So the sitting torso and standing arms were sort of mixed and matched together, so these little posing nubs had to be removed. Unfortunately, since these parts aren't really meant to fit together, some green stuff did have to be used to fill in some of the gaps between the legs and the body. Using my new favourite hobby tool, thanks to Anvil of Doom, the toothpick, it was quite easy to fill these little gaps in the model. Some arms were then attached, the sitting arm to control the actual machine as he's walking along behind it, and then also this toolbox slash backup power supply arm. The heads didn't have to be crafted because I had it left over from the last time I made one of these guys. The base was quite simple, just milliput spread out and some of the tracks impressed behind. After figuring out roughly where I wanted everyone to go and making sure there were tracks behind everything, some little rocks were glued to the base, and this little unfortunate bony friend there trying to escape a blood pool. Though using milliput on the base did mean that there was a little bit of overhang, which was then shaved back with my knife. Texture paint could then be applied all over the base, but I made sure to avoid the actual inside bits of the tracks to make sure that the model would still sit right. Everything was then glued to little cocktail skewers and primed black. As I remove these here, you might notice that some bits you haven't seen before are there, such as the servo skull from the Scions kit and also those armor panels, which are a normal part of Kataphron breaches. There was no conversion on them, so now is the first time you're seeing them. I started off the paint job with some iron warriors. This was dry brushed over all of the iron mechanical detail type arrangement pieces. This leaves us with a really nice, pretty much one and done metal, but it does have some, well, spilling out over some of the other parts, and so some Abaddon black was used to clean that up. After which I used a 50-50 mix of Abaddon black and Eshin grey to begin building up some of that grey for our armour. This is quite thinned and built up only towards the top 70% of the model, after which the 50% mark was then filled in with pure Eshin grey, also thinned down. And I'm keeping the edge a little bit more jagged to try and make the transition a little bit less noticeable. And in a second I use Mechanicus Standard Grey, which is a particularly big jump in colour, so these techniques are particularly important to keep that gradient subtle. But it doesn't have to be perfect, because our next step is to apply some non-oil to darken everything down and tie it all together. But I did decide to use this on the tracks a bit as well, as they felt a little bit too bright for something going through all that dirt. I then did the final step on the grey, which is a highlight with pure Dawnstone. This is the only time I do any edge highlighting on this model, but I do think it's very worth it on these flat armour panels. To add a little bit more colour to the model, I took out my corn red and painted this stripe along the front part of the side armour panels. After the lines were sketched in on either side, they could be filled in reasonably easily, and some Carroburg crimson was painted in between the lines, again to try and darken them down, but also to create a little bit of a gradient in the red. A 50-50 mix of Rhinox hide and Balthazar gold was then painted across all of the bronze and gold details, after which pure Balthazar gold was painted across the light-facing areas of the metal. Remember, these come from both above and below in metals, and the next stage of highlight was formed with a 50-50 mix of Gehenna's gold and Balthazar gold. All of the trim was then washed with Agrak's Earthshade. This darkened everything down and smoothed out blends, as I more or less always use washes to do. All of the control panels, buttons and pipes on the model then had to be painted in. I mainly used random bright colours for this, but the radar screens were given a little bit more care, with moot green used to make those lines there. And then a dot of warpstone glow where the lines crossed. The casings on the model were then painted in with a burgundy made from Cantor blue and corn red, and then highlighted with Mephiston red. It was then time to paint in the fatigues and leather areas of the little pilot fella. I used Rhinox hide for more or less all of this, but if you miss any of the recesses, it's not enormously important. Since it's black underneath, it just looks like darker sections of the brown. This whole model's quite dark, so any black areas are reasonably easy to overlook. All of it was then highlighted up very, very stippily. This is not an edge highlight, it's just sort of stippling on Gothel brown. This texture that it creates in all this stippeliness makes it look a little bit more worn and realistic. But in order to spread out the fatigues from the actual leather, some wildwood contrast paint was thinly applied over the top. I then moved on to the black areas, but you can see here easily as well that I applied some glow from the control panels to the armour as well. Mechanica standard grey was used for the highlighting. Bone areas of the model were then painted. I used Gothel brown, Baneblade brown, and Screaming Skull, and layered these up over smaller areas of the skull, as they went up in brightness. The eye sockets were then painted in with thinned down corn red, and then the brighter areas of the eye sockets were then brought up a notch with some thinned down Mephiston red. Now, these never work quite so well, so when I apply that little dot of white to the middle, you can see it actually seems to be more to the sides. But it ended up looking good enough, so I stuck with it, even if it didn't end up looking particularly glowy. It was now basing time, and painting in all of the ground was done first with Rhinox hide. This would make the majority of the sort of brown, dirty texture at the base. This was then dry brushed up with Gothor and Baneblade brown, colours I've used quite a bit throughout this model, which gave me a nice defined dirt texture, even if it should probably be a bit muddier. The rocks were painted in with Mechanica's standard grey and then dry brushed with Dawnstone. I am deliberately using quite a lot of the same colours over and over again, as I think it makes the final model look a bit more harmonious. I then applied some Vallejo still water, first just out of the depositor thing, and then pushed it around with a toothpick to make sure it got everywhere I wanted it to. This takes a couple of layers to build up, but once it's dry, a 50-50 mix of Blood for the Blood God and Black Templar contrast paint is painted over the top to give it a nice dark, congealing blood look. And nice wasn't really the right word there. And some Carroburg Crimson painted over the skulls and other bone details. Some tufts were then applied to the base to give it a little bit more, or, well, to give it some life. And I realised I'd completely forgotten some purity seals. The parchment was then painted in with, you guessed it, Gothor and Baneblade brown in much the same way I'd done on the skulls. If you don't want these colours to repeat as much, then you can use tints to slightly more differentiate the bone from the parchment. The lines of text were then painted in with Abaddon black. This was quite thinned down to make sure it came off the brush easily and was just done in little lines. The red was painted in with Corn and then Mephiston red, also avoiding all of the deepest recesses already black, as with most areas on the model. But we're not done. It was time for some freehand. I wanted a little Inquisition symbol somewhere on the model, and though I did try quite hard to get this on camera, it wasn't really working out. So I made a little guide with some pictures, but all you're going to see here on video is me doing the top and bottom line. So you had the top line, the bottom line, the one down the middle, a little blob, some side bits, and then you fill in the details with the base colour. And as you can see, this is roughly what we're left with. I think these are some of my best freehands. I thought it turned out really pretty well. And now it was time to assemble and show you what it turned out like. I think this model turned out particularly well actually, and though it's not nearly as fancy and different as my infantry for this army, I still think it does more or less exactly what I had envisioned it to do. The eagle-eyed of you may have noticed it appear in one of my community tab posts a few months back, but here it is now finished. If any of you are hungry for more Inquisitorial Strike Force, stick around because there's more of that coming. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.